today, obviously, we're celebrating one of our Womble thought leaders, Dr. Clay Carson, in connection also with Black History Month and our diversity efforts. And my introduction of Dr. Clay Carson is very easy because I know him pretty well. We were much younger men in 1990 when I met you, and when you came to Atlanta. Dr. Clay Carson is the Martin Luther King Centennial Chair at Stanford University. Is that your title? He is the authorized biographer of Martin Luther King by Coretta Scott King. Correct me if I'm doing anything wrong.
Sounds good so far.
He is writing a 6-volume history of 14-volume history. We were much younger men then.
I just haven't got to the 14th volume.
And his latest book is Martin's Dream, which just came out. There's a copy on each table. And when this is over, we're going to announce how you might win that copy on your table. And if you don't win, and obviously in all the other offices, we can arrange for you to get one through Amazon. So one way or another. We're honored to have you here today. Thank you very much. I'll let you take it on.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful for me to be back here. I've been coming to Atlanta pretty regularly since 1985 when I got that phone call from Mrs. King. And this has become a second home almost. I've taught at Emory and Morehouse. And it's been a real pleasure. One of the things about the book, though, is that I talk about the downsides of the work that I've done over the last 20 years, but mostly it's been good. I was contacted by a publisher probably about 2 years ago, 3 years ago maybe, about doing a book on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And from the very beginning, I thought of this book as both a historical study of what has happened to the nation, what has happened to the King legacy, and all of that. But I also wanted it to be a personal story because my life has been so intertwined with the King legacy. As a 19-year-old, I was at the March on Washington. And in many respects, my life is kind of divided between the first 19, where I grew up in a small town of Los Alamos, New Mexico, where there were 3 black families, and going to the March on Washington, by the way, without telling my parents I was going to go. They would have been very worried, and one of the reasons why, one of the ironies of this is that they thought by moving to this ex-military community, my dad was in the military in World War II, that we would somehow be outside the race problem. That, I never think in terms of, in my own experience, of moving into a white neighborhood. They built our house, and we were the first family to move in. So all these white people came to our neighborhood. And so it was a kind of a different experience growing up there. But being at the march and getting involved in what we call the movement, and I put that with a capital M, of young people, pretty much like myself, who were trying to change the world. Right before the March on Washington, I met Stokely Carmichael. Some of you who are older in the room probably recognize that name. Then he was a philosophy major at Howard University. And he was the first person I met in the movement. He wasn't at all well known then, but I could see that there was something really unique about these young people. A few months later, I met a man by the name of Bob Moses, who was a math teacher in New York. And he had come to Mississippi to work in the movement. And meeting these people who were about my age made me aware that there was something really unique going on in the world that went way beyond Martin Luther King. In fact, they thought of Martin Luther King as, here's this leader trying to catch up with us, because they saw themselves as going far ahead of Martin Luther King. He was too cautious for them. And that perspective has really shaped the way I've viewed Martin Luther King and his legacy ever since, because they kept saying like, well, he's a wonderful symbolic leader. We're very inspired by what he does, but more like what he says. But the movement is much more than that. And so sometimes I begin a talk by saying, we wouldn't be talking about Martin Luther King today if not for Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks made Martin Luther King possible, not the other way around. And when we talk about the sit-ins of the early 1960s, or the freedom rides, or the voting rights campaign, all of those were started by grassroots leaders. Martin Luther King had very little to do with that. So when I got that phone call, I brought a perspective to the work that I'm doing now. And that perspective was an understanding that there was this vast movement. And Martin Luther King understood that. He often talked about himself, said, I'm a symbol of the movement. I'm not the movement. And that, again, even going back to the March on Washington, you begin to see it in a different perspective when you understand that Martin Luther King didn't organize the march. He came there, and they gave him the honor of giving the concluding address, in part because no one wanted to speak after Martin Luther King. So you had this wonderful event, and in writing the book, what I tried to do is started out with a chapter about this 19-year-old kid who went to the march and how the march seemed to me at the time. And then over the course of the book, you begin to see how I came to a deeper understanding of the march, Martin Luther King's speech. I had the privilege, 30 years after the march, of putting together a book which you can all get called The Autobiography of Martin Luther King. And what I did is went through all of his autobiographical writings and organized it as a narrative. And when I got to the chapter on the march, I had that unique feeling of here, 30 years earlier, I was looking up on the platform and watching him give this address. And now I'm trying to describe what is going through his mind as he's looking out at people like me. And it was a wonderful experience. It gave me a sense of everything that he represented. And more recently, I was involved, and this is another chapter in the book, in designing the King Memorial in Washington, D.C. And that experience of trying to reflect something that I couldn't have understood as a 19-year-old there. If someone had told me that 30 years later, there's going to be a memorial for Martin Luther King, who's giving this speech at the march, and from the Lincoln Memorial, you'll be able to look over toward the Jefferson Memorial, and you'll see a memorial for Martin Luther King. All these things would have been inconceivable. And so part of what the book is about is all these events that if someone had tapped me on the shoulder at the march and said, guess what, in a dozen years you'll be teaching history at Stanford University, African American history. Well, some of you are probably old enough to understand what an impossible dream. I might as well have said, I'm going to be living on Mars. There were no African American professors at Stanford University. There was no field of African American history at the time of the march. So this has been a process of coming to an understanding about my own life, coming into an understanding about what King represented. Part of what happened, this is now almost 30 years ago when Mrs. King called me, is I first turned her down. And it was partly because I had said, look, I'm not writing about Martin Luther King, I'm writing about the movement. And in fact, other people have written these biographies of Martin Luther King. I'm writing about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And my first book was about the young people like Stokely Carmichael and Bob Moses, they're the ones who are the kind of the main figures of my story, because they were the ones who were doing the work at the grassroots level. So I told her that maybe I'm not quite the person for this, and I suggested some other names. One thing I found out about Mrs. King is that once she decides on something, it wasn't easy. She said, well, I'm going to be out in California, why don't we get together? And so we spent some time in San Francisco. Then she invited me down here to Atlanta, and I came down and visited the center. And by that time, I kind of knew, in fact, my wife put it very bluntly. She said, do you want to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder saying you could have been editor of Martin Luther King's papers and you turned it down? So listen to your wife. It was a good decision. As you follow that story, you find that there were days when I wondered whether I should have done that. But I've come to understand that my initial perspective, this bottom-up perspective of looking at the movement from the point of view of people like Bob Moses and Stokely Carmichael and Fannie Lou Hamer and so many other names, Fred Shuttlesworth, names some of you probably haven't heard before, but they were essential to the movement. They were essential in everything that Martin Luther King did. But I needed to understand who was that guy who gave that speech at the March on Washington. Obviously, if you had to choose who was the symbol of the movement, they didn't choose Stokely Carmichael, they didn't choose Bob Moses. Even people in the movement said, yeah, it's Martin Luther King, of course. When they asked who was going to do the concluding address, there was no question. Everyone knew it was going to be Martin Luther King. So there was something special about this person. So I've tried to understand what that specialness was. And I think to put the answer quite bluntly and shortly, he was the visionary. He was the one who understood that the struggle was much more about than something concerning a seat on a bus. It was even much more than civil rights legislation. If you go back to that speech he gives at the march, many of us came thinking that we were there to pressure Congress, as if we had any power to pressure Congress. One of the reasons why they put us down at the Lincoln Memorial is it's as far away on the National Mall as you can get from Congress. But that was the goal, was to try to get Congress to pass civil rights legislation. And if you go back and look at Martin Luther King's speech, he does not mention civil rights legislation. It's not even in the prepared text that he did. He's talking about something else. He's talking about realizing the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And he said, we've come here to cash a check at the Bank of Justice. Does this nation really stand by those ideals that Jefferson wrote down? Now, one thing I'll tell you about when you go and see the King Memorial, stand in front of it, look over your shoulder, and what do you see? Anyone? Across the tidal basin, you see the Jefferson Memorial. Why is this important? Well, what is King saying? For me, the meaning of the memorial is Martin Luther King symbolically is in this perpetual dialogue with Thomas Jefferson. Did you mean what you said? Did you mean what you wrote? Here's a nation that justified its existence. Basically, the Declaration of Independence was a declaration to the world saying, we want to be independent. These are the principles we stand for. Now, did they stand for it? No. I mean, Jefferson was a slaveholder. But that was what the assertion was. compared to Europe, we're a democracy. You know, we do stand for equality. And that became, those words became the language in which African Americans from the beginning expressed the desire for freedom. Go back and look at the speeches of Frederick Douglass back in the anti-slavery crusades. He's saying the same thing, sometimes in very harsh language about when are you guys going to live up to these ideals? The notion of pointing out the hypocrisy of the nation was the most powerful rhetorical tool available to black orators. So it's not a surprise that Martin Luther King at the march does this, uses this rhetorical tool. And in fact, some of his language really mimics what 19th century orators like Frederick Douglass were saying. So you begin to understand how this perpetual dialogue is at the center of American history. Can we, will we live up to those ideals? What is Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address stating? During the Civil War, he's saying, can a nation so conceived survive this war? And that kind of a dialogue has been enriched in so many different ways. But Martin Luther King is an essential part of that dialogue. I think that's why the I Have a Dream speech has such resonance, even today, is that we're still asking that question. You know, you can point out that Thomas Jefferson did not add the term when he said all men are created equal. He did not say all American citizens are created equal and endowed by certain rights. What does that say about our current debate over immigration policy? You know, all of these things, this dialogue it's been going on since the beginning of the nation. It's still going on now. Now, I think that one of the aspects of my work that kind of came together toward the end of it, and I said, I've got to pull together the first part of my life, at least my scholarly life, my adult life, with the second part, you know, this emphasis on grassroots activity, and also my deeper understanding of how Martin Luther King is talking about something much more fundamental, much more global, much more broad in its historical context. You know, I think of three dimensions of Martin Luther King. One is historical. Where are we in history? Second is global. And the third is what I would call spiritual, intellectual. You know, where are we in the moral arc of the universe, as he would put it. And his great speeches always touch on these three different dimensions: historical, global, spiritual. So how does that come together with this grassroots activity? Well, I'll just say a few words about the last year. I've gone to a number of commemorations of the 50th anniversary of not just the March on Washington, but I think equally important, perhaps more important, the Birmingham campaign. And I'm actually in the process of doing a new book that will re-examine the Birmingham campaign, which is just crucial in American history. It is the climactic battle of that stage of the struggle. And it's a wonderful story. And for me, it kind of starts with Martin Luther King, this guy, Fred Shuttlesworth, who is the local leader, who is crucially important. He's the one carrying on the struggle from the 1950s into the 60s. He's the one who's confronting Bull Connor in Birmingham. He's the one who's home is bombed. They used to call it Bombingham. He's the one who's beaten up by police, beaten up by the Klan when he tries to enroll his kids in, previously all-white school. And he was the one who says to Martin Luther King, "You've got to come to Birmingham." Now, one thing about Martin Luther King is he was relatively cautious, as some of the students complained. And probably the last place he wanted to go was Birmingham. I mean, Martin Luther King was stabbed in New York City, so he didn't have to go to Birmingham to risk his life. So he puts Fred Shuttlesworth off for a long time. Finally, 1962 comes along, and he agrees, yeah, I'll bring SCLC. We'll have our convention in Birmingham. September 28th, 1962. It's the last day of the convention, and it's actually gone quite well. No violence. They get to the last day of the convention. Martin Luther King comes in to kind of give a wrap-up speech, standing on a stage just like I am. A guy, white young man in the audience, comes up to the stage, smashes him in the mouth, starts beating on him. And this incident, the people rushed up, surrounded the guy, pulled him away from Dr. King. And after that, you had the sense of Fred Shuttlesworth saying, "Okay, welcome to Birmingham. This is what we're dealing with." And rather than running away from it, Martin Luther King says, "Okay, let's do a campaign in Birmingham. We've got to do it. If we can't win in Birmingham, we can't win in the Deep South. We can't win in Mississippi. We can't win all the places we need. And without doing that, we can't get John Kennedy to introduce new civil rights legislation. We have to highlight the segregationist resistance." So they launch this campaign in April of 1963. And it starts out really well. They have a number of people, young people are very eager to confront Bull Connor's police. They go in, do sit-ins and all these sorts of things. And their basic strategy from the beginning is, we're going to fill the jails. They really think they can do it. Bull Connor saying, "I got more jails than you've got people." And after about a week of this, it turns out that he's right. He simply opens up more jail cells and eventually takes over the fairgrounds and puts a fence around it and says, "That's the new jail. We've got more jails than you've got people." Furthermore, he goes into court and gets an injunction forbidding further demonstrations. Martin Luther King is faced with this decision, what to do. It comes on Good Friday, April 1963. He's contemplating the defeat of this movement because his lawyers say, "You can't do it. This is an injunction. That judge can keep you in jail as long as he wants. He doesn't have to allow you to even get bailed out. Furthermore, you're out of bail money." Martin Luther King says, "Well, I have to go to jail. I can't allow all these people to stay in jail. I've got to join them." And his supporters are saying, "You can't do that either. We need you out of jail to raise more money. Go around the country, have fundraising events, bring more money into the campaign." So he faces all of this at a crucial meeting, room 30, Gaston Motel, owned by a black millionaire who lived in Birmingham. And he decides, "I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to jail." Goes into a room, contemplates this, comes out wearing his jeans, overalls. Everyone knows he's going to go to jail. Goes to jail. He's held in solitary confinement. His jailers tell him, you're defeated. It's over. No one else, not enough people are going to jail. It's declining every day. The movement is going to go away. And then he gets word, finally gets out of solitary, probably in part because Coretta calls Robert Kennedy and gets some pressure put on to get him out of solitary. His lawyers, he's allowed to meet with his lawyers. And one of them, Clarence Jones, and he's recently written a book about this, comes in from New York and says, I've just talked to Harry Belafonte. Actually, also talks with Nelson Rockefeller. You're going to get as much money as you need for the bail. So that kind of revives the movement. But then he gets everyone bailed out, and the movement is still stymied. Just not enough people. And then his followers come with another proposal. We might be out of adults, but there's these high school students. They want to join the movement. And we've been forbidden from allowing them to march. If we let them march, this is going to change. Martin Luther King reluctantly gives in. Then we have those scenes, which some of you have probably seen the photographs of. May 2nd and 3rd, 1963. Hundreds, then thousands of students flood into 16th Street Baptist Church. And then from there, into the downtown area, overwhelming the police. Bill Connor's sitting there, what am I going to do now? His police are saying, we can't even process this many people. And a lot of them are juveniles anyway. What are we going to do? He arrests as many as he can. I found this wonderful narrative of this 9-year-old kid spends 1 week in juvenile hall, and she talks about her experience. It's funny because she's interviewed by these police, and they're asking her, did communists tell you to do this? And she says, no, I found it out from my church. And it's a very wonderful little narrative interviewed with her. But in any case, that turns the tide for the Birmingham campaign. These young kids, teenagers, sometimes not even teenagers. Now, what does that suggest to me? What's the story of Birmingham? Well, think about this. If it hadn't been for those teenagers, if it hadn't been for that 9-year-old girl, Audrey, Martin Luther King would not have been asked after a failure in Birmingham to come and give the concluding remarks at the March on Washington. He would never have given the I Have a Dream speech. Almost certainly he would not have received the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. There wouldn't be a King holiday. So when I think of the Martin Luther King legacy, I think of a great orator, a great speaker, and all of that sort of thing. But I think of that 9-year-old. She made Martin Luther King possible. Martin Luther King didn't make her possible. And I think that is the story of the struggle. It was those two things coming together, of that desire for freedom now from the grassroots, a leader who was a visionary, able to come in and communicate that, and that wonderful letter that he wrote from Birmingham jail, the most important essay of the 20th century, his letter from Birmingham jail. And that combination of determination and eloquence, I think, are at the heart of American history. What I would like to just conclude on is, some of you are aware of Taylor Branch's wonderful trilogy about that he calls America in the King Years. Think about that title. Just think if John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and all these other people whether it ever crossed their mind that they were living in the King years. And yet when we look back at that time, that's such an apt description of America facing the question of whether it was going to become a real democracy. I think right now we're in still the early stages of that democracy. 50 years is not a long time for a democracy. We don't know the outcome. The notion of a culturally, racially diverse democracy is something new in the face of the earth. We don't have a lot of experience. Can it last 100 years? So I think that what I would see as the importance of this work is that we need to tell that story. I think of it, and this is, I grew up on the Bible and as a young kid going to church, reading about the Exodus story and how that story still inspires people. And sometimes I think now we're telling another Exodus story about how the majority of people on the face of the earth went from being a peasant or a peon or a slave or a serf or all the other names for people who were kind of excluded from decisions that affect their life, how they became citizens of the country where they happen to be. I think it's a really important story, and I do hope that as I tell it, that you'll understand that that's an essential story of American history, and it needs to be told well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, do you have time? Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Carson. We have time for a few questions, and we have a mic. Who's first? That's a scary question too, right? Who's first? Right here.
I just wanted to know, when you went to the march, you were in college at the time?
Yes, I just finished my first year of college.
And where did you attend college?
University of New Mexico.
Okay, thank you.
I then, in part because of the march, I then transferred to UCLA. I had a sister living out in Los Angeles, and I wanted to be closer to the kinds of activities that I saw at the march, and I joined a group very much like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but a group focused on urban issues like housing and jobs and things like that.
Right here. Here we go.
So first, thanks for being with us. I really enjoyed your remarks. I like your frame of this conversation between Martin Luther King and Thomas Jefferson that you say is still ongoing. I'm curious about your thoughts of the quality of that conversation today, and what you think, if you think it can be improved, what you think are the keys to doing that.
The first thing that went through my mind and when you wrote that question, gave me that question was a lot of things happened on the way from the design of that memorial to the execution of the memorial. We have someone from the museum here in town, so you kind of know that process. If you go and look at the King Memorial, there is a major design flaw. The statue of King is not looking at Jefferson, it's looking at Reagan Airport. And the model for that was a photograph that's on the front of my edition of the autobiography of Martin Luther King. It's a photograph, very famous photograph by Bob Fitch, and it's King at his desk and Gandhi there. But if you take that book and hold it up next to the statue, you'll find it's a reverse negative. Yeah. His left hand is his right hand. That was the only person I've seen when I've been there many times, and I was standing next to a woman who said, he's not wearing his ring. I said, yes, he is. It's in the other hand. So because of that, but that's...
Well, they did that with the Hubble space
Now I've ruined the experience for all. You'll just go there and say, listen,
as well.
it's backwards.
Mm-hmm.
But apart from that, the quality of the dialogue. I don't think most Americans understand that we're in the dialogue. That this is the essential dialogue of American history. It's, again, we're unique among nations in terms of justifying our existence with a statement about equality. And to have people question, well, if you justified your existence, can't I hold you accountable to that? Can't I go, as King put it, try to cash that check at the Bank of Democracy? And I don't want to get told insufficient funds. So that's always going to be, that to me is the question. Again, I would use the example of immigration. I think the argument for all these undocumented, 10 million, 12 million, whatever, no one knows because that's part of the problem. That's the question they should be raising. They should be saying, but Jefferson didn't say American citizens. Jefferson said all men, and he meant it in terms of mankind. So why not use that? Why not say you're being hypocrites? First of all, you're being hypocrites because a hell of a lot of Americans, their relatives, ancestors, came to America without a visa. So they're illegal. So this whole issue, I think, needs to be addressed in that kind of a context of what does it mean? How are we going to be a multiracial, multicultural democracy? If someone closes the doors to this room and says, look, you guys got to stay here. Well, hopefully we'll have some food, but you've got to stay here for the next couple of years. Do you look around the room and say, yeah, this is a pretty diverse room, that's good? Or do you look around, I'm not sure if I can get along with all these people for the next 2 years? I mean, and when you think about it in terms of the earth, but unless technology really develops in the last, we're going to be living here on this earth in a very culturally diverse world. To me, terrorism is a warning signal. It says, if you're in a room like this and somebody's having a bad day, you better know it. And especially if everyone in the room is carrying a weapon, which has become America. So this is something that I think we need to really think deeply about. My friend Vincent Harding has said, we need advanced courses in democracy. We're at kindergarten level. And how do you do democracy? How do you trust your future, your destiny, to someone unlike yourself in terms of class, race, religion, all these other things? That's what you're doing. You are trusting the destiny of this nation to people who are very different. And that's scary to some people. Well, it should be, because we haven't really tested it out. But the way of dealing with it is not to dig your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist, but to try to figure out, what does that mean? What does that obligate us to do? we need to find out if somebody's having a bad day. Someone thinks that they're getting a raw deal. Yeah. Anything else?
After that, any other questions? Well, let's. Do we have any more? Or are we
I think
good?
right there.
Right here.
You mentioned that after you started the project that you kind of questioned your decision. What was it about the project that made you kind of have second thoughts even after you were involved in it?
Oh, like one of the things that I was forewarned about was, and this was from people who are biographers of not just living people, but people who have living heirs that have an interest in the outcome. And it's difficult. It's never easy. It's because, in a way, I'm sharing their inheritance. You know, I'm kind of the non-family member in the room, saying, yeah, you know, we've got to work this out. You inherited everything from your father, and I've been kind of given this job of taking care of it for you, with you. And that's an interesting, complex relationship. And you know, one of the chapters is, you know, right after the beginning, you know, Mrs. King named me to be editor on May 17th, 1985. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from her saying, you know, I really don't think this is going to work unless you move to Atlanta. Well, I'm sitting out in Palo Alto with my kids in the Palo Alto schools, and I get this letter saying, move to Atlanta. Well, I don't have anything against your city. But at that point, that caused a major crisis. And that had to get resolved. And we battled it out. And you know, those are the times when you think, why in the world would I do this? But after a number of months, we worked it out. And what it meant basically is I got to know every flight to Atlanta very, very well.
I don't know anybody who does that.
Yeah, I mean, remember Eastern Airlines. Yeah, I knew all the flight attendants, and yeah, it was interesting for a couple of years.
Let's do one more, and we'll have a bit of fun with our drawing.
There's somebody else.
Who's that?
Besides that initial rocky start, did Mrs. King ever call you up at some point and say, I don't like what you wrote, or you got it wrong, or anything like that?
Yes. Those were private conversations, and they will remain so. However, one became public, and that was when I discovered that King had plagiarized some of his academic writings, and that was a very difficult period. But again, there's another chapter. There's a couple of chapters that are really almost dedicated to Coretta, because I spent, I guess it was 1998 or so. I came, and this was when I was teaching over at Emory. And at that point, you know, I'd been trying to get into the papers in her house over on Sunset. And so she finally agreed, in part because I think these had become extremely valuable, and keeping them in a basement was no longer tenable. You know, these are the papers that are now over at Morehouse, and actually some of them will be over at the museum. And I was the one who, and my staff and including my wife, Susan, we spent weeks, probably months, going through the basement, pulling out things and the discoveries of love letters between the two of them, which I published some of those. They're absolutely beautiful love letters. Very love letters she wanted to keep confidential because they were expressing political opinions that weren't very popular during the McCarthy era. One day I was in there and I reached in a box, pulled out a yellow pad. I started reading it. It was handwritten by Martin Luther King. It was his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Just a yellow pad. And things like that. If you're a historian, those are your mountaintop moments. I mean, and it was just a wonderful experience. And also just working in her house, and I would come up, and sometimes she'd be sitting in the kitchen having a cup of coffee or something like that. And what did you come up with today? And I would be able to talk with her about things that, along with things like Christmas cards and just other little things that you keep in your basement or your attic. And those were the kinds of moments that I mentioned earlier. There were times when I said, "Why did I do this?" Those were the answers. This is why I did this.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great time. Dr. Clay Carson, thank you.